if you are grieving, it's because you loved and you were loved. It's a natural part of being in love with somebody.
That is. It's beautifully said.
Welcome to Before the Buzzer Conversations, real talk about death, legacy, and what matters most.
I'm Keith, a retired physician.
And I'm Michelle, his daughter, a broadcasting professor.
I'm not dying yet.
Thank God. But even in health, we know death will come, and we need to talk about it.
You know, it's important for parents and their adult children to have those conversations, Michelle.
But it's not always easy to talk about, and that's where we come in.
In this podcast, we'll talk together about what needs to be done before you pass, and provide practical ways for you to have these conversations with people in your life.
This is not about doom and gloom. It's about living with purpose, passing on what matters most, and finding peace, even in the unknown.
So before the buzzer sounds, let's have a conversation.
Grief is like a long valley, a winding valley, where any bend may reveal a totally new landscape. C.S. Lewis wrote that in his book, A Grief Observed.
Yeah, this is really a poignant book that he penned while he grieved the death of his own wife, Joy Davidman. You know, in that book, he also said, her absence is like the sky spread over everything.
There's no getting away from it.
It just doesn't go away.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I haven't experienced the loss of a spouse.
Nor have I yet.
Yeah. So the grief that I have experienced in my life is nowhere near the level of grief that he's talking about. He obviously is so gifted with words, but it just sounds like it's just all encompassing.
You know, that particular story is he got married late in life, and when he married her, he already knew she had metastatic cancer. So the 4 or so years they had together were periods of remission, but also this, if you will, cloud hanging over them. It's a heavy one.
This is a heavy one. Grief, Lament, and Hope is the title of this episode, and we will all face grief at some point, so we're going to talk about it. Let's talk about these in 3 different ways: physical, emotional, and spiritual. So start physically. As a physician, what does grief look like physically?
It often leads to changes in sleep pattern. They may have insomnia or disrupted sleep, where they're waking up at night with dreams or nightmares, or they maybe have what we call hypersomnolent, where they just can't get out of bed and just want to pull the covers over, and it can be either or both, and it can oscillate between those two over the seasons of grief.
Okay.
So that's a real common one. Mm-hmm. More common than not, appetite's affected. People don't eat as much food. Like a depressed person might say that the food now tastes gray. It's kind of lost its savoriness, if you will. So there's that sort of sense that many of one's senses are dulled.
Yeah, life's just lost its spark and its joy, so everything is dulled.
Everything is dulled, and so that gets amplified through our physical experiences. Bowel habits can change, our interest and ability to maybe walk or exercise. So it's physically, of course, a prolonged grief, which we'll get into, can lead to a more substantial problem. Grief is something that will lead eventually to some emotional scar tissue that allows you to move on with life. But for some people, just the way that God has designed them, this may trigger a more serious mental health issue.
Okay. So that's then just very tied into the emotional, physical and emotional.
Yes, that's what I would say. Now, yes, one may also experience other things like headaches or some visual blurriness, particularly if they haven't been eating and drinking appropriately. They may have some heart symptoms like palpitations, racing heart, some breathlessness, other things that, if they're new, probably talking with your physician about would be important, but many times they're, if you will, linked to the emotional trauma that people are going through.
Now, I've heard stories about people who've died of a broken heart. Is that something that actually happens?
Well, not actually a fractured heart, but yeah, I do think that people can get into this spiral of grief and remorse and sadness where their systems begin to shut down. There is evidence that it affects our immune system as well. And so our ability to have a robust response to infectious disease or cancers or other things. I remember when my brother died suddenly in his 30s, it was just 6 months later that my mother died of advanced cancer. And I wondered at the time as a physician was that accelerated her life expectancy was shortened just because of the grief she carried by the death of a child, which is, many would agree is probably the biggest challenge that we would have on earth is the loss of a child, almost at any age.
Yeah. Oh, of course. Yeah.
Including pregnancy loss.
Yes. Oh my goodness. Yes. When would you recommend someone go see a doctor versus knowing this is just comes with grief and it'll pass eventually?
Well, some of that ties into what we talked about in the previous episode about your community. As you go through these emotions, if the people around you are concerned that you're stuck or seem to be going in the wrong direction or starting to withdraw, maybe more than many people would in that situation, and particularly if you are unable to care for yourself. We talk about ADLs, activities of daily living, hygiene, food preparation, getting yourself dressed, toileting. If those begin to slip, that's often a clue that you probably ought to at least touch base with your health team. That's often hard to see in ourselves unless we're unusually self-aware, but when we're going through grief, everything is, fogged in. So, having those people in your life that can speak truth into your life and maybe nudge you even though you don't want to hear that's important.
You're right. It goes back to that episode we talked about community. Just, to die well, you've lived well and you've built a community around you. And even if you're the one who is preparing to pass, making sure your loved one has a community that will check on them, maybe even asking people to check in on a parent or a child or family members would be wise. And then if you are a member of the community, I know a lot of times people want to let people grieve in private and they think of it as something very personal and private, but if you're in that inner circle, you probably need to knock and open the door yourself occasionally just to make sure, like you're saying, these things that people might not notice because they're so deep in grief don't go unchecked.
Exactly. There's the acute trauma. Even if somebody has a lingering death because of an end-stage disease like cancer, there's that very acute hours, days, weeks where it's just a deep, deep lament of the heart, really sad. And then there's some... there's people then start to come up for air a little bit, and they often at that 6 to 8 week period out, that's another common point to dip. As you would expect, all the typical anniversaries in that first year, whether it's an anniversary of a marriage or a birth of a child, a birthday, major holidays, those are all typically times. And then and most people can probably relate to this. The interesting thing about grief is that there's the predictable times that we just mentioned, but that there's totally unexpected times. All of a sudden you start crying. There might be a tune that comes on the radio or a scent or something visual as a clue that brings you right back to that loved one, and you're back down into a cycle of some grief. So I think we have to have people's experience varies, but we have to have sort of a broad lens when we think about this.
And to be easy and show yourself grace and the people around you grace as well. Because, so many times you have to go back to work and you have to, maybe if you have children to take care of or, you have to do these things, yet you really need to build some, almost like I'm envisioning like a pillowed space around yourself to kind of like let yourself bounce around and, have a soft landing spot and showing yourself grace in those moments.
Right. Yeah.
So if you do go to the doctor, what's the doctor going to do? Are they always going to put you on an antidepressant, or are there other recommendations that they'll have?
Well, if you're connected to, and of course my recommendation would be a good primary care doctor that's a good listener and asks the right kind of questions.
You're retired though, so do they exist?
There we go. Yeah, of course they do. They're gauging where you are in this grief cycle and also this grief scale. They're going to screen you, as we typically do for depression, with various symptoms. So don't be surprised when people ask you if you're suicidal or, what's your sleep pattern, what's your eating pattern, really trying to get a sense of, is this, if you will, more normal grief, or is this sort of crossed over or bleeded into a clinical depression, particularly because its depth and its length, that requires some medication, whether it's something short-term to help with sleep, versus something longer term because there's a depressive cycle that needs to be treated for 6 or 12 months at a minimum.
Yeah, and this is where it's important too to remember that there's an emotional and a physical aspect to this. So just because you are clinically depressed that's a physical thing that's happening in your brain,
Right.
and you need medical intervention
Yes.
to help with that. And
That's-
as you know, someone who has benefited greatly from
Mhm.
antidepressive medication, I preach it. It does help. It really does. And
Yeah.
to not be ashamed or scared about that, because it really can help you overcome that.
Yeah, and I think one of the things, as I shared in an earlier episode, as 40 years as a Christian primary care doctor, a family doctor, there's always this debate. I mean, are Christians really shouldn't be leaning on these medicines because it's really lean into God, it's God's grace, you're not praying enough, you don't have people praying for you,
Makes me so mad.
versus is this a physical problem? And I've always sort of understood it's right in the middle. You really can't get on with your life and your spiritual life and your relational life unless the chemicals are rebalanced.
Right.
Not everybody needs that, because this is a hit that God's allowed into your life, and many people have chemical resilience that they can come back, but some people get depleted and get stuck,
Yeah.
and they need to have medication.
Yeah, and God has allowed people to invent that and
Right.
figured out how the brain chemistry works and how to help people overcome those
Exactly.
times. So this is a great segue, Dad. I want to talk spiritually about what grief means, because we have the biological reaction, the emotional, and the physical reaction, but there's also a spiritual element to grief. God allows grief. And it's part of his plan, like you just mentioned. Like, he allows these hits to happen to help shape us in whatever he wants to. But there's a word for it spiritually as lament. Can you talk a little bit about what that means?
Yeah, we see in the Old Testament lament as part of this aspect of the spiritual dimension of life's setbacks, whether it's grieving over the death of somebody or even a financial reversal or some, back in biblical times, the Jewish people being taken into captivity, whatever that might have looked like, which was a real trauma that we see modeled in the Psalms, particularly, many of which that King David wrote, this sort of cycle of lament, which includes the call to turn to God, his sovereignty, that he's not punishing us. This has been allowed into our life. Purposes sometimes we don't fully understand, but in his sovereignty and our trust and faith in him, we have to believe he's allowing this into our life. We need to name the grief. We shouldn't sweep it under the proverbial carpet. God, I am feeling sad, depressed, really deeply hurt by the loss, angry, whatever that looks like, really naming it, and particularly really thinking about how it's affecting us personally, then asking for help. God, I know you're there. I know you've grieved. I know that you grieved the night before you were crucified in the Garden of Gethsemane. I know you have been there, Jesus. So I just ask that your presence is there, and then just that renews that confidence in God. So that's that lament cycle that so beautifully penned in the Psalms, and we see it lived out in the Gospels.
To hear you say it like this, it's almost like a spiritual practice that, if you don't practice that, your grief, your battle with grief, your living with grief, your struggle with that grief, that emotion is going to be prolonged and maybe harder. But if God has called you through allowing something traumatic to happen in your life, has called you to this lamenting process, that's part of how he's using your spiritual growth, or how he's helping develop you.
That's right. That's right. And, we don't want to be overly formulaic here, that turn to the Bible, which I think is true. But for some people, they can't concentrate, they can't focus on the words. They might only get through one verse and it tears up. So it may be music, hymns, that may be it may be some other way, prayer, solitude, reflection. I mean, all of the above. So
being in nature, it's really, personal, like you said, and it doesn't have to be. I remember there's been times that not experiencing this level of grief, but I read one verse of the Bible and that's it. Like, that spoke to me, and I need to sit there and feel that. And so just, yes, Dad, like you're saying, like, it's not formulaic. It's not like, okay, your spouse died or you just got a terminal diagnosis. Here's the steps. This is what you do. ChatGPT, how do I do this?
Right.
That's not how it works. You just really have to be show a lot of grace to yourself, those around you, and really be open to how God can use that in your life.
Absolutely. I mean, just like we quoted C.S. Lewis earlier, he experienced the loss of his wife like the sky. It was everywhere. So I think just having that sense that this can be all-consuming, depending on your personality, don't overly compartmentalize it. It's going to come up at some point.
Yeah.
You can try and shove it into a closet or a
Right.
drawer, but it's going to come out. So you gotta walk through this.
Yeah, it's just like we said in the beginning, grief is inevitable. Death is inevitable. I mean, it's one of the reasons we're doing this podcast is, not to joke about it, but honestly, like, you need to realize that this is going to happen, not just to you, but the people that you love. And with that comes grief, because if you have a parting from someone and you love them, there will be a negative feeling associated with that: anger, grief, lament. And so you need to embrace that and really make sure you experience that. Something I want to talk about too is, a lot of people are going to be listening to this podcast in a life stage like you and I, Dad, where we know we're going to die at some point, or someone in our life is going to die, but no one has yet. But we're listening to this because we know it's coming. And there's a term that you introduced me to as we were preparing for our podcast that I'd never heard before. And I kind of wish I'd never heard it, because it makes me so sad. But it's called anticipatory grief.
Mm-hmm.
What is that? What does it mean? When do we feel that?
Well, from a definition standpoint, we'd say it's kind of that natural feeling of loss or grief that occurs before the death of a loved one, or even before your own death. So if you're in a lingering state and you've got metastatic cancer and you really have this sort of sense that the end is coming, it's that anticipation and therefore grieving of that emotional state. Again, referenced the Garden of Gethsemane. I mean, we see that so beautifully illustrated in Jesus, asking 3 of his apostles to pray with them, and, praying that cup would be passed, but not my will, but the Father's, literally sweating blood. So we see what that anticipatory grief can look like. And I think just being aware of it, and it can look different ways. I mean, we whether it's our own situation or if we have a loved one, maybe we're getting more irritable or short-tempered or whatever. I mean, part of that's just the process. So I think just being aware that unless it's a sudden traumatic car accident where it's a sudden situation, that as death is approaching, you're going to experience some emotional stuff.
I think we need to pause and talk about the difference between anticipatory grief and anxiety. Because as a parent, I can work myself into a tizzy imagining all the ways my children could die. And especially as a young mom and having babies and toddlers, that was much bigger issue. And I've learned to take hold of those emotions and set them aside and not allow my brain to continue playing out the role play in my mind. There is anxiety, and then there is something anticipatory grief, where there is actually an event coming that and it's almost like your body knows this grief is coming and you're getting prepared for it. But you might need to put on a happy face because you're caring for the person.
It may be that your presence, without displaying a lot of those emotions of anticipatory grief, is important for maybe you're a caregiver and you do have to sort of be strong. Not to say that you're plastic, having some emotion, engaging that, and yet not ignoring it either. That maybe in your own prayer closet or with your support system, you're having somebody to process that with, I think is important.
Okay, so thinking about that support system, what are some practical ways that we can come alongside someone who's grieving?
I think it's important to realize that there's a number of things you shouldn't say. I mean, I'm a big believer in a pregnant pause or silence is very, very important. In fact, probably the most important thing we can do is just our presence. And that is often maybe just sitting with somebody, holding their hand, letting them talk. Silence is just beautiful. But really being careful to avoid trivialized or trite comments. Oh, they're in a better place, or they've sprouted their angel wings, or their pain is gone. All that may or may not be theologically correct, but it's trite. And so I think not trying to fill in an awkward silence with a cliche that often works against what you're trying to accomplish.
Right. No anecdotes. No tangential. I have a friend who lost a child, and she was saying the same thing. Just don't tell me where you think my kid is. Don't tell me he's in a better place, because the better place for him is in my arms. In the moment, that's all you're thinking, and say his name and tell me stories about him that you remember. And
Yeah. And there's a tendency too, and I get stuck in this sometimes, is to sort of default into telling my own story. Oh, I know what you're going through. I went through that a few years ago when my mom died. And, let me tell you how I got over that. I mean, now you're being in a therapeutic role, and it just is not helpful.
Yeah, this person did not sign up to hear your story. Like,
right.
You've come alongside them. This is about them. It's not about you.
That's exactly. Yeah. Mm-hmm. And this is where you use all your senses. You need to be present. You need to be other aware and self-aware about what to say and what not to say.
Okay. So our whole podcast, we've been talking about dying well, like for yourself too. How do adult children have these conversations with their parents? How do parents prepare to die well? So for the person who is going to be passing, what are some things that you can do before that's happened to prepare your family to grieve you well?
Well, I think if there is that opportunity to say goodbye. Now, we talked in a previous episode just about those handwritten letters that people will discover after you die. If you end up doing that as part of your could-do list, which I think is a gift in the future. But if you are lingering in hospice or in a hospital bed in your home, that opportunity to have some one-on-one time with each of the people that are in your most inner circle and just telling them that you love them, making sure those 4 things we talked about previously have been taken care of, and that it's going to be okay. And I think if you are able to tell them not only that you love them, but that you know that God loves them, that God will be with them through this transition, and that they're going to be successful in the years to come, and sort of being that coach and that encourager, I think is a real gift.
Yeah, it is. And I wanted to bring up another C.S. Lewis quote here, because the thing is if you are grieving, it's because you loved and you were loved. It's a natural part of being in love with somebody. Another C.S. Lewis quote from that book of Grief Observed: bereavement is a universal and integral part of our experience of love. So feeling grief means you've loved. So if you're experiencing that, it's also something to remind yourself, I wouldn't be experiencing this if I had not loved. And God calls us to love one another. So it's part of that process.
That is. It's beautifully said. So, it's a final reminder after our conversation in today's episode that grief is natural. And it's part of the reality of loving someone, as you said, Michelle.
Well, Dad, this is our final prepared episode of our little mini-series podcast here. It's been really fun to do this, even though those are tough topics. They need to be talked about. So I love it. We will come back soon in the next few weeks with another episode where we answer listener questions. So if you've been listening and we didn't cover something that you were hoping we would, or maybe you even have just an anecdote that you'd like to share that you think would be important, we would love to come back and include that. So make sure you let us know.
Yeah, absolutely. It's not too late to contribute to that conversation. I mean, we're here to facilitate a conversation both with some content and some knowledge and some experience, but also trying to model how those conversations could actually happen. But this is a knowledge-sharing community, and we just love your questions and insights so we can contribute this as we've intended so that God will be glorified.
Yes, amen, amen. Well, thank you so much for listening to these 6 episodes so far. We hope that they've been helpful to you and those that you love. Please pass this podcast along to anyone you think needs to have these conversations, because as we've been so clear, they are so important and they really need to happen before the buzzer sounds.